Indian Comic Con for inviting me here and having me here. This is a great convention. This is my first time in India, and I've never quite seen a convention like this in an open air market. So this is great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our company, John and Cordley, and going over all the books. But first, I just wanted to go over the context of graphic novels in North America, because I'm not sure if everyone knows sort of the difference between regular comics and graphic novels and so on. So I'll just start with it now. So John and Cordley itself began almost 25 years ago. They're just setting up the presentation here. And throughout these last 2.5 decades, we've published many of the best cartoonists in the world, among them Chester Brown, Chris Ware, Seth, Kate Beaton, Julie Doucet, and many others. Now, comics or graphic novels initially never had an easy go of it in North America, in part because it was an uphill battle of sorts against widespread perceptions that it was a genre whose primary audience was children or adolescent boys. You couldn't really blame the public for having these viewpoints. After all, up until recently, the vast majority of all English language comics being published were done primarily for a male adolescent readership. And yet, gradually over the years, a new sensibility in comics emerged, where at this point there's now a large group of cartoonists creating work for mature readership, dealing with a wide range of subject matter. The work is often personal, sometimes even of an autobiographical nature, and many ranges of topics are embraced. These new graphic novels further distinguish themselves in that the voice of the author is often unique and inimitable. Where mainstream comics like, say, the Hulk or the X-Men are created by an assembly line of pencilers and artists and colorists, all with the goal of making a uniform product, these graphic novels are, for the most part, the unique vision of one individual. Now, this approach to graphic novels can be traced back about 45 years or so to R. Crumb, who is he was then, and you could probably even say today, like the most famous cartoonist, and certainly one of the most talented. And of course, he's here he's one of the guests at the India Comic Con, and he'll be here, I think, on Sunday with Gary Groth. Although Crumb has remained an influential and prolific figure in the decades since, the initial underground comics movement was short-lived, more or less coming to an end at about the same time that hippie culture fizzled out in the early 1970s. Now, things looked bleak for comics for the remainder of the 1970s, as few new cartoonists beyond Crumb emerged. As well, there were not much in the form of a publishing or distribution infrastructure needed to support a burgeoning movement, so things more or less languished up until about 1980. However, things started changing by the beginning of the 1980s, with a series of events that would go on to form the foundation of today's graphic novel movement. In July 1980, Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly launched Raw magazine, an avant-garde comics anthology that featured work from both Europe and the United States. Aside from introducing comics from the likes of Charles Burns and Jacques Tardy, it was in the pages of Raw where Spiegelman's groundbreaking book about the Holocaust, Mouse, was first serialized. When Mouse was later published in book form in 1986, it of course went on to become one of the most successful graphic novels in publishing history, and was key to in influencing a generation of new cartoonists. So another important event in 1982, Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez's Love and Rockets first debuted from Fantagraphics, whose publisher Gary Groth will be here tomorrow. And like Raw, it was extremely influential both during and the years since then. The Comics Journal, published by Fantagraphics as well, served an important role at this time because it was the first and only publication of its kind devoted to comics criticism. What was important at the time was that now comics are being written about in many publications, the New York Times, you know, newspapers and magazines across the world. But at that point, this was it. There was nothing else out there writing about comics, where they're, you know, writing about the news stories or you know, writing critical reviews. So it was important in its time. So against this backdrop, in 1989, I started drawing a quarterly, initially working on the kitchen table of my apartment in Montreal, in Canada. Within the first couple of years, we started publishing many of the cartoonists that we're still publishing now, over 20 years later. So this is one of the first comics we published a couple years into the lifespan of our company. A comic called Yummy Fur by a cartoonist named Chester Brown. Now, back in the 1980s and 90s, it was very common for there to be comic book pamphlets that would serialize stories. So as opposed to today, you'll have a graphic novel. A cartoonist will work on a book, and then it'll just come out in a bookstore like that. Back then, a cartoonist would often have what would be called their own series, and they would actually write and draw many different kinds of stories. So, for example, in Yummy Fur, Chester Brown started off with this absurdist comic called Ed the Happy Clown. But then at the back pages, he would actually have Bible stories, his interpretations of the Bible. And then later on, he would have very deeply personal autobiographical comics. Another early comic that we published was this comic series called Dirty Plot by Julie Doucet. And she was a also very well-known cartoonist, very influential, and many people refer to her as the female R. Crumb. R. Crumb's influence was very wide-ranging, influenced her, and I would say that she probably was influenced in her subject matter and in her style and approach by Eileen Kaminsky Crumb as well, who, of course, is also a guest at this comic convention. Another early cartoonist that we published, this is by around the mid-90s or so, was Adrian Tamina. He did a comic book series called Optic Nerve, which is actually still going on today. Adrian is probably one of the most important cartoonists today. He started publishing Optic Nerve when he was in high school. We did the first issue when he was only 21 years old, and his influences are probably owes as much to literature as it does to comics. By the mid-1990s, this is when the transition sort of happened, where you started going from cheaper pamphlets, comic pamphlets that would cost $3 or $4, to graphic novels that tended to be more ambitious. This book over here is called It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken by Seth. Again, he's one of the first cartoonists we work with and still work with today. This was a book that was semi-autobiographical. It actually turned out that most of it was made up, but it sort of was based on events in his own life. And then a few years later, this is a book also by Chester Brown. This one is called Louie Riel. This was actually very successful, in particular in Canada, because it actually deals with a series of historical events in Canada in the 19th century. And what's interesting is that it's by this point, this is around 2003. By this point, many cartoonists were actually doing very different kinds of subject matter. A lot of the books I mentioned were autobiographical. By this point, you see cartoonists moving to nonfiction works, and the work tends to be broader, and it sort of tends to be about subjects that the general public you could say relate to more. In this case, Louie Riel, which at least everyone in Canada knew the story. This is a cover of the New York Times magazine. The reason why it's up here, aside from the fact that Chester Brown drew it, was I mentioned before how the Comics Journal was important because it was the only publication that actually even noticed comics at all, let alone, let alone, like, it also wrote about comics a lot. Up through the 90s and up until the early 2000s, there was actually no coverage at all, almost no coverage at all. And when this came out in around 2004, this was the first time that a major publication was actually talking about the new form of graphic novels. And I would probably trace it back to this, 8 years ago when this came out as sort of a turning point, when people in North America started sort of accepting graphic novels more. Over here, this is a book called Pyongyang, a book, of course, on North Korea. This was done by a cartoonist named Guy Delisle. And again, it's interesting because you see the kind of subjects that cartoonists take on that are very wide-ranging. In this case, a book on North Korea. There's hardly any books on North Korea at all because it's so few people, including journalists, are able to get in. So this was actually very important, and it's still cited very often now. And it's also a good example of what you can do with graphic novels. You could do anything. You could do books about your own life, or you could do books about a communist dictatorship. This is a book by an Israeli cartoonist named Rutu Modan. And again, by this point, about 10, 15 years into our company, we were working more and more with international cartoonists. In this case, Rutu Modan, this was a book of fiction, but she was actually taking, real events, in this case, suicide bombings, and making it an integral part of her, of the actual story. And over here, this is a series of books we published called Aya. And Aya, again, this is the author, the writer of this series, named Marguerite Aboué, grew up in Ivory Coast in Africa. And she lamented the fact that, whenever we hear about Africa or read about Africa, it tends to be negative information about, wars or famine or disease and so on. So she wanted to actually try to portray a different, a different vision of Africa. In this case, something that was widely influenced by her, her own experiences growing up in late 1970s Ivory Coast. And then this is a cartoonist that we started publishing a few years ago, Lynda Barry. She actually has been around much longer than we have been as a company. She's been around since the late 1970s, and she's actually one of the most important and influential cartoonists in the United States. She had a weekly newspaper strip for 30 years, and she's written novels and off-Broadway plays, and we're in the midst of collecting all of her work now in book form. And then here's another example of a international cartoonist. This is Dilli Haat, who lives and works in New Zealand. And this is a graphic novel called Hicksville. This is a fictional book about a fictional comics library in New Zealand that has all the graphic novels in the world that were ever published before. And no presentation on graphic novels would be complete without mentioning Chris Ware. Chris Ware was also, I would say probably one of the most important, if not the most important, cartoonists of the last 22 years or so. He virtually reinvented the language of comics. I mean, he sort of took what everyone else was doing and made it his own. I don't have actual samples of his pages, but if anyone here is just beginning to read graphic novels or American graphic novels, I would suggest that Chris Ware should be there in your top 5. This is a book that came out last year. This is actually a very ambitious project that he has. He's collecting the story arc called Rusty Brown, but they're each individual stories that will eventually be this 1,000-page story, this 1,000-page book or so. And then I mentioned before how we have an international scope, publishing cartoonists from all over the world. This is a series. It's a wonderful series by a cartoonist named Tove Jansson. She died in 2001, but she was a remarkable writer and cartoonist. She was based in Finland, and this is a series called Moomin that, again, she's written books about Moomin, but the comics were done in the 1950s in a British newspaper. But they were unpublished. They hadn't been collected in 50 years, and so this was the first time that the comics themselves were being published in English in book form. And later this year, actually, we're going to be republishing some of the Moomin books in color. We're taking the black and white comics that were published in the hardcover volumes, and we're coloring it. And the idea is that we're doing it to be respectful to her vision as an artist, which means that, nowadays when you see recolored works, you'll often see this, like these garish, flashy, Photoshoppy, material that would not suit her work at all. So what we did is we actually took some of her old children's books as samples, and we actually sampled some of her color palette to make it look like it was a book from the 1950s. I mean, the material was from the 1950s, but it's colored now. And then this is a cartoonist from Japan that we've started publishing about 7 years ago. His name is Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And Tatsumi is another remarkable example. This book on the left, called The Drifting Life, is his memoir. And he actually did it late in life. He's in his late 70s right now. He's been working since the 1950s in Japan, and this is part one of his memoir. It's an 840-page book, and it only goes up to 1962. He's hoping to have the next volume out soon. The book on over here is a book that's going to come out in a couple months called Fallen Words, also by Tatsumi. And what he did is he took this tradition in Japan, this called raguko, which is a spoken word theater, and he took these spoken word classics and turned them into comics. Again, another example of that you could do anything at all in comics. There's no real barriers. And then this next slide, staying in Japan, this is one of the most famous cartoonists living in Japan. He's actually going to be celebrating his 90th birthday next month. This over here is a semi-fictional memoir. I think he said it's 90% fact. So I guess you could say it's mostly nonfiction. And this is a book about his experiences in World War II. So a lot of this stuff actually happened. He did actually lose an arm in World War II. He lost his right arm, which was his drawing hand, and then he had to relearn how to draw with his left hand.